Hello everybody, PC here with my cup of coffee. That's why we call this Coffee with PC. Having a little pick-me-up this mid-morning, a little shot of espresso mixed in with my regular coffee there, a little oomph for this midweek. I hope you're doing great today and always appreciate you spending just a few minutes with me on Wednesdays as we kind of touch base and typically look at some part of the Bible and see what we can learn from it. And we've been doing that for the last several weeks, looking at one particular story Jesus tells, or one particular parable. Parable is as we said, I remember my definition as a kid, an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. That Jesus would often tell these parables that would use common everyday things that were to make a greater point. And we've been looking at this one, sometimes called the parable of the sower, because it's a farmer who sows seeds, sometimes called the parable of the soils, because the focus is on the different types of soil that the seed lands on. And we've been looking at that for a few weeks just to try to see what we can learn from it. And we're going to come to the end of it today. We're going to come to the fourth of the types of soil. And it is, well, I guess we'd say the best soil, the right soil, the proper soil, whatever word you'd like to use there. Jesus actually calls it the good soil. What makes the good soil good? Well, as he tells this story, he summarizes it this way. But the one who received the seed that fell on good soil is the person who hears the word and understands it. He produces a crop yielding 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. And so here Jesus, having contrasted these other soils, finally gets to the one that is the purpose. I mean, why does the farmer go out and sow seed? He goes out and sows seed because he wants a crop. That's the goal, to get that seed to germinate, to grow, and to produce the fruit of whatever kind of seed it is. That's why he does it. He wants a crop. And this is the only one of these four soils that actually produces fruit. And the farmer says it's good soil. Jesus says this is good soil. Now remember, what's the connection? What is Jesus trying to say? He's not trying to tell us when you go plant seed in your garden, make sure the soil is good. No, he's using this parable to tell us something about ourselves and about his kingdom. And we've already gone over this, but for a quick refresher, in case you missed one of the previous ones, this parable, he tells us the seed is the message about the kingdom, the message about Jesus, his love, his life, his death, his resurrection, salvation, forgiveness that God offers. And so the seed represents the message of Jesus, or sometimes we call it the gospel, the good news of salvation. And the soil represents our hearts and their receptivity to that message. And so here we finally get to the only of these four different types of soil that receives it and produces fruit. Notice he says he hears and he understands it and he produces a crop yielding 160 or 30 times what was sown. And so really the question we've got to ask ourselves as we go through this is, what makes this soil the right soil? What makes this soil good soil? Well, I was thinking about this, and it took me back a few years. If you've been around our church for a while, you know I've talked a lot about growing up in Central Florida. And in Central Florida, we weren't a farming family in the sense that we made our living off farming, but we had farms, we had orange grove, we had gardens, we had all these sorts of things, mostly for our own use. The grove gave a little bit of produce that was sold, but pretty much we had gardens to feed our families. And on this kind of family area where my mom's parents and a few of her siblings lived, several of us had gardens. And so I learned a lot, well, whether I wanted to or not, about gardening. My grandfather, my granddaddy as I called him, was kind of the guy I looked up to the most and loved to spend time with. And he had quite a great green thumb. He could grow a wonderful garden, had many wonderful things out of there. And he taught me along the way how to do things. And I know that when it was time, when the right season of the year came along and we were going to plant the garden, we didn't just go out and start throwing seed everywhere. You read this parable and that seems to be kind of what it is. But you know, if you've ever grown a garden, that you don't just do that you have to take time to prepare the soil. One of the things we had to do was till up the soil. Now, I was thrilled, and I've mentioned this before, when we got a motorized rototiller that you just put a little gas in, pulled the crank, and it did the heavy lifting for you. But there was a period of time where we didn't have that, and it was more manual labor. But nonetheless, one of the first things we did, since the last time there was garden there, things had grown up and grown in, and so we got that tiller out, and we went over the whole garden, breaking up the ground. And then after the ground was broken up, a lot of times in that process, we'd come across rocks or other large objects. Well, those had to be moved out of the garden. Those weren't things that you wanted in there. We wanted it just to be that rich soil. And so we'd spend the next little bit, as the tiller knocked them up, we'd move those, whatever was kind of a larger, maybe not even that large, but even something, small rock, and we'd get that out and collect them and take them out of the garden. And then the next thing we'd typically do is with our rake or other implement, we would take all of the different grasses or weeds that had grown up in there, and we'd rake them, and we got all of that stuff out of the garden bed that we were preparing, so that when we were done and you looked at that bed where we were going to plant the garden, it was just that rich soil ready to receive the seed. Now, here's the question. Did you make any connections when I was talking about this to this particular parable? Because I think this is really maybe the point we need to talk about, and maybe the point, the implication that Jesus was wanting us to think about. And that is this point: good soil doesn't just happen. It takes work. It takes preparation. To get a good soil, to get the ground ready to receive the seeds, so that ultimately we would get a crop of 130, 60-fold, whatever the multiples are. Remember when we planted the corn, we'd get a corn stalk and we'd pull some ears off of it, or beans or okra, whatever. To get that, we had to take some intentional time to prepare the soil so that it would receive the seed and it would grow. And if you think about it, in many ways, what we did was making sure that the soil we had in our garden wasn't the path, and wasn't rocky, and wasn't thorny, right? We used the tiller, we got the tiller out, and we broke up the hardened soil. Because if we didn't do that, it would be hard packed ground. And if we throw the seed on top of the ground, it's not going to penetrate. And just like Jesus says, maybe birds or other animals are going to come along and say, hey, this is a nice tasty snack for me, and we'll never get anything out of that. We also remove those obstacles, rocks and other things that were in there, because those aren't good. They don't allow the roots of the plant to go very deep. They keep it shallow. Maybe it grows around the rock. And so when the sun comes out, as it gets hot, or some of the other things happen, it just wilts over because it doesn't have good deep roots to get the nutrients and the water it needs. And we got rid of all the other weeds and things, because those weeds, if we left them in there, even though we tilled it, they might just themselves grow up. And because weeds are like that, they always seem to grow faster than the garden plants you want. And they could have grown up so fast and overrun the garden and choked out the corn or the okra or whatever else we had planted, because that's kind of how weeds operate. Which is exactly the three types of soil that Jesus said were problematic. There was the path, the hard soil. There was the rocky soil. There was the thorns or the weeded soil. And so the message I take out of this from my own experience and from reading Jesus is, if I want to have a fruitful life, if I want the message of the kingdom about God, about his love, about Jesus, his forgiveness to penetrate and really make a difference, I've got to prepare my heart so that it can penetrate and grow and bear fruit. I've got to watch myself that my heart doesn't grow hard. You know, what is a hard heart? Obviously, a hard heart, if we compare it to a path, is that nothing gets in. You know, I can be, if I'm not careful, I can lean towards cynicism. And we live in a day where it's easy to get jaded by so many things, to be cynical about so many things. If we're not careful, we'll have a cynical heart, and we won't let anything in. We'll be so guarded, we'll be so careful, we'll be so jaded that it won't, that path, well, nothing's going to happen. The word, the message isn't going to get in. And to use the second type of soil, the rocky soil, you know, sometimes, as we said a few weeks ago, life is hard. And people aren't always thrilled with our faith in Jesus, and they might even ridicule us. And if we're not careful, those things can not allow us to grow, but we'll just kind of wilt away. We'll say, it's not easy living for Jesus, so I'm just going to shrink back and not try. Or it's no fun when people make fun of me for trying to follow God, so I'm just going to wilt away, just like that second soil. Or then the thorns, There's a lot of other concerns in the busyness of our life, as he says, the concerns of this life and the pursuit of wealth and the deceitfulness of riches, that we run so fast and we try to make ends meet. And particularly in our Keys environment, where a typical family really has to scramble just to make ends meet, to afford the cost of living down here, we could see how pursuing all that could choke out any room for the seed to grow, because we're too busy to have time. But we got to prepare the soil. We got to say, okay, how can I make sure my heart isn't hard? How can I guard against jadedness? How can I get those rocks out? How can I make sure the weeds aren't there? And it's all about being intentional. Can I use that word? Does that make sense? About being intentional, about making room. On a Sunday morning, for instance, we have worship. It's not always easy or the first thought on people's mind, I'm going to get up and go to church. Maybe it was a few days ago or whatever, but when Sunday comes, have you ever noticed there can be things that just come up? Maybe it was you were out late Saturday, or something with the family on Saturday, friends went out, whatever it is, and so Sunday, it's just be nice just to sleep in a little bit. It's hard to do that. Or maybe you're saying, I'm going to be more intentional about hearing the message, reading the message, or praying. And it seems like, boy, you know what? I got to go into work early today, or I've got to do this, or the busyness of that, or I got to take the kids here. And before you know it, all of that just kind of gets in there and it chokes out. See, we've got to prepare the soil of our heart. We've got to be aware. And I think this is what Jesus is encouraging us to do and warning us, so we will do it, is to keep the soil of our heart good. Because just like now, the message is going out, the message of the kingdom, that God loves you, he sent his son Jesus to die for you, and he wants you to know him, have life and forgiveness in Jesus. The message is going out. And maybe right now, you're watching and listening, the question is, will it grow and will it produce fruit? In our church, we hope that it grows. We hope that it produces fruit. That's why we get together. That's why we worship. That's why we have our small group meetings. That's why I chat with you for a few minutes every midweek, every Wednesday over a cup of coffee, to encourage you to let the message about Jesus really make a difference in your life, because he is our true source of hope and life and forgiveness. I hope you know him today. I hope you're guarding the soil of your heart, keeping it soft and ready and rich to receive the message so it can grow deep and you can be fruitful. After all, Jesus says he had come that we might have life and have it abundantly. That's what you want from your garden. You want an abundant harvest, and God wants an abundant harvest of joy and peace and love and kindness in your life. And that comes when the soil of your heart is prepared and the seed is able to grow deep and produce that kind of fruit. Well, that's my encouragement. I hope you've enjoyed this trip through the parable. Jesus told a lot of parables like this and had some interesting insights and some good messages, some good reminders for us. So hey, even in this same chapter, Matthew chapter 13, you can read a few other parables, and maybe we'll look at those in the weeks ahead. So thank you, as always, for spending a few minutes with me. I've got to get back to some things. It's Wednesday, so we have study tonight, and we're getting ready to go out of town next week. So a lot of loose ends to tie up. So I better take a big swig of this caffeine shot and hit the ground running. Thanks again for joining me. Thanks again for your listening, and I hope in my prayers for you that the message that we share every week really penetrates and really makes a difference, that encourages you and spurs you on to follow God with all of your heart. Well, I'll leave that with you and say, take care, have a great week.